Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? Today I want to talk about psychic damage in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. And remember, one of the things I said at the very beginning of this series is I want these books to stand on their own. I want to judge this game based on what's in these books, not what somebody else tells me is in these books or what it actually means. And so I had something happen to me the other day as I was looking at cantrips and everything, and I looked at the Bard's cantrip, and one of the Bard cantrips is Vicious Mockery, and I found out that it does 1d4 psychic damage, as well as causing, I think, disadvantage on the target's next attack roll if they fail to save. I thought to myself, psychic damage, huh? How about that? And I looked a couple other places, and sure enough, there was some things called psychic damage. Now, I started to look around in the book and said, I saw reference to this before, and I kind of passed over it as I was skimming other sections that I really wasn't doing anything with at the time. And let me go back and reread this and try to find some stuff out. And I looked at the index, and I was getting really confused and going down one rabbit hole after the other until I realized, oh, it's one of the types of damage. And so then it started to become more clear to me until I actually looked it up and looked it up everywhere it appears in the books, and it became a little less clear to me. And, so let's follow me down this rabbit hole. And, I came up with some conclusions about psychic damage. And overall, I think the idea is a good one, but a little half-baked, and some of the things just don't fit. But anyhow, let's go right on to this. First of all, I think the place you need to really start out with is, what are hit points, right? So we'll go to the definition of hit points in this particular book, because I don't want to come up with, what do I think hit points are? Let's look at the book. Let's judge these books on themselves. And it says right here in the Player's Handbook, 196, hit points represent a combination of physical and mental durability, the will to live, and luck. Okay, and that's cool. I mean, that's something that I like to represent or have represent hit points anyway. Not that this video is about my bias and preference, but certainly, somebody like Tim Cass talked about the old versions of D&D where, hit points represented your luck, your ability to avoid the telling blow. And finally, when you get down to 0 hit points, well, they finally hit you. They finally really did real damage and knocked you out of the fight and maybe killed you. So, anyhow, and that also makes a lot of sense or jives with the game in terms of things like healing surges that fighters can have sometimes, or the idea that after a short rest, you're able to, if you'd like, spend some of your hit dice to regain some of your hit points. It's not just physical injuries, it's your mojo, it's being banged around, all that kind of stuff. Maybe your mental toughness, all that kind of stuff. The way healing works in this game really helps to represent that. Anyhow, spent too long on that anyway, but let's look at the damage types. There's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, I think, damage types. Acid, bludgeoning, cold, fire, force, force is pure magical energy focused onto a damaging form. Lightning, necrotic, which is dealt by certain undead, and a spell such as Chill Touch, which withers matter and even the soul. Okay, it's easy to picture necrotic damage. Piercing, poison, psychic, mental abilities such as a mind flayer, psionic blast, deals psychic damage. Radiant damage dealt by a cleric's flame strike spell or an angel's smiting weapon sears the flesh like fire and overloads the spirit with power. Okay, it's kind of easy to start to picture what radiant damage is. It's actually easy to picture what psychic damage is. I have to infer it. Slashing, thunder, and thunder is a continuous burst of sound, so it's sonic damage. Okay, great. So that's what these different types of damage are, right? So let's take a look and see what the book actually says about psychic damage, or what the books say about psychic damage. So the first thing I found out, looking through all 3 books and looking through the, searching for the term, finding every possible time it says psychic damage, I found out some things are immune to psychic damage. They are webs of any kind, razor vine, objects, wall of ice, including the wall of ice that a white dragon puts up, the green dragon thicket type lair, very evocative of the Sleeping Beauty thing. That's immune to psychic damage. The tentacles of a roper, also immune to that, and a shield guardian's amulet. These are the things that are listed as being immune to psychic damage. The other thing I found as I'm reading is in the optional sanity rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide, page 265, it talks about the idea that you should make a sanity roll anytime that some kind of attack or circumstances causes psychic damage. And when you make a sanity roll, you may in fact go insane. Okay, so this is kind of like creating more of a picture in my head, even though that's an optional rule, that psychic damage, once again, is one of those things that just overloads the mind. and causes you to be a little bit nuts. I mean, it's easy to think of that if you know what a psionic blast is. But they don't really define exactly what psychic damage is in the book. It just says a psychic damage is caused by something like this. But what is it? But anyhow, let's not be mean. Let's go and take a look at all the other places that it says. Well, there's some exceptions for psychic damage, where you won't actually take psychic damage, despite, outside of those things that were declared to be immune to psychic damage. And so let's see, what are these actually? Okay, a barbarian with the bear totem spirit, who is raging, has resistance to all damage except psychic damage. This isn't a resistant to it. This is except psychic damage. Well, wait a minute. It says here in this player's handbook, let's see, did I lose the page? No, I didn't lose the page. It says damage types. Different attacks, damaging spells, and other harmful effects deal different types of damage. Damage types have no rules of their own, but other rules such as damage resistant rely on the types. Okay. All right, so, all right. Anyhow, this barbarian is resistant to everything. All damage. Radiant, necrotic, not psychic damage. Okay. Let's see. The 10th level warlock, who is made a pact with an old one, has resistance to psychic damage. Only takes half damage, and whenever a creature deals psychic damage to it, then that creature also takes the same amount of psychic damage that the warlock does. Okay. And let's see what else does it say about resistance. Here we go. Here's some things that are a little bit more familiar. The Feign Death spell. Target has resistance to all damage except psychic damage. It doesn't have special rules. All right, anyhow, Mind Blank. This grants immunity to psychic damage and to things like being charmed and being mind read and all that kind of stuff. Okay. All right. Okay, well that handles all the resistance to psychic damage listed in the book, and also the places where you can be harmed by anything else plus psychic damage, which gets through for some reason. All right, but let's go back and find out what exactly causes psychic damage. Well, before we do that, there's one last thing. I'm going to look at what causes psychic damage to the bad guys. All right, there's a few things here where it talks about the psychic damage caused to creatures other than you. If a hag's eye is destroyed, this little eye they make, the coven makes where they can see stuff. If the hag's eye is destroyed, then each coven member takes 3d10 psychic damage and is blinded for 24 hours. Okay, pretty evocative. This causes them this great mental anguish. All right, and if you're trying to get the control gem out of an incapacitated slad, and you fail the medicine roll to get it out there, then the slad takes something like 4d10 psychic damage, because that must really suck having your control gem ripped out of your brain. Oh, and if a Drow priestess of Loth fails at summoning, I forget what the thing is called, it takes 1d10 psychic damage if it fails to actually summon the thing. All right, that's the monsters. What about you? What causes you and your friends psychic damage? Well, a mental effect of the psychic wind on the astral plane can be 2d10 or 4d10 psychic damage. And keep in mind, some of these things have saves. I'm not going to list every time you get a save, but it could be a wisdom or charisma or constitution save. All right, an enemy within the 30-foot aura of gloom of a 20th level Oathbreaker paladin that is afraid of the paladin because of another failed save will take 4d10 psychic damage at the start of every turn while they're in that aura of gloom. Must be pretty awful. All right, a creature that attempts to play an instrument of the bards without being attuned to it first will take 2d4 psychic damage unless they save. A creature that can't use a manual of the golems and attempts to read it takes 66 psychic damage. Must be a pretty horrific book to read. But I wonder why the instruments are so horrible to play. Okay. Wand of Wonder. One of the results is when you cast Detect Thoughts on a creature. If you're not pointing the wand at any particular creature, then you take 1d6 psychic damage instead. Artifacts. Artifacts have major detrimental properties, and you roll in this random table, and two of the possible results are that you take 4d10 or 8d10 psychic damage when you become attuned to the artifact, because it's so horrible to become attuned to this thing. All right, a particular artifact, the Book of Vile Darkness. You can use an action to recite words from this book in a foul language known as the Dark Speech. You take 1d6 psychic damage, and all non-evil creatures within 15 feet of you take 3d6 psychic damage. I think it's for like every turn that you do that. Pretty horrific stuff. Pretty evocative. More evocative than playing a lute that you're not attuned to. All right, another artifact, the Sword of Kas. When you take it out of its scabbard, and if you haven't got the sword soaked in blood within a minute, then the sword attempts to dominate you, and if you succeed at the save, you take 3d6 psychic damage. If not, then the sword dominates you and makes you do stuff. Makes you kill somebody, so it's all soaked in blood. Okay, pretty evocative there too. There's a disease called cackle fever, aka the shrieks. And anytime you undergo a stressful event like being pulled into combat or getting hurt or whatever, or I guess, or having the bejesus scared out of you, you have to make a con save or you start to take 1d10 psychic damage. And then you're incapacitated with laughter for 1 minute. Yeah, Jason, I am reading this out of all 3 books. This is every single instance of psychic damage or any reference to psychic damage in all the books. All right, an aboleth. Aboleth can charm a creature, which will take 3d6 psychic damage, among other effects, and the aboleth takes those and adds those to its hit points, because these are hit point damage. They can also target creatures in the water around their lair for 2d6 psychic damage, and I guess, blast them. A shadow demon. The melee, the rules are all over the books, Jason. A shadow demon. When they do a melee attack, it's not physical damage, because they're really kind of immaterial, and they're not really kind of there. And it does either 2d6 plus 3 or 4d6 plus 3 psychic damage, depending if they have advantage or not. Alrighty. Fomorian, which they made really kind of fey in this edition. I'm not sure if they did in other editions. That big giant can give you the evil eye once per turn. And within 60 feet, you got to make a save, or else it'll do 6d8 psychic damage. Githyanki warrior and Githzeri monks, pretty much is what they are. When they use their swords or their fists, they do physical damage to you, but also the swords or the fists of the Githzeri do psychic damage as well, and very, very evocative for what those creatures are and all the psionics that they're steeped in, the lore, the original lore of those creatures. An intellect devourer, another iconic D&D monster. One of the things it can do to you is give you this kind of blast, and you have to save or take 2d10 psychic damage. Mind Flayer. There we go. Here's the bad guy. When he hits you with his tentacles and kind of gets ready to take your brain right out of your head, a beautiful head like mine, does 2d10 plus 4 psychic damage is what those tentacles do, and you must be really freaking out at that moment. When he gives you the Mind Blast, they call it Psionic Blast back in the Player's Handbook, but there's no psionics yet. Mind Blast, that got past the proofreaders, by the way. Mind Blast, 48 plus 4 psychic damage, unless you save. The psychic version of Grey Ooze, I remember that from way back when. You have to save or it does 3d6 psychic damage to you. It can just give you this Mind Blast. Bzamp. All right, let's see what else here. Well, we're getting there. We're getting to the end. The kiss of a succubus or incubus can cause 5d10 plus 5 psychic damage, unless you do make a save. Let's see what else happens here. 14th level warlock can hurl you straight through hell, and you appear right back where you were. And if the target is not a fiend, this is the warlock that's made a pact with a fiend, by the way, you take 10d10 psychic damage, the target takes that, upon their return because of the horrific experience. Very evocative of the picture of what psychic damage seems to be, this horrible, affront to your psyche itself. Even though it doesn't really say that in the book. It doesn't really tell you what the hell it is. All right, let's see, what else? Contact other plane. No, PCs do not have psychic hit points, Jason. That was the first thing I started looking for. Hit points are hit points. It's just these are psychic damage to your hit points. If you cast Contact Other Plane, you have to make a saving throw. On a fail, you take 66 psychic damage, and you are insane for the rest of the day until you take a long rest. The spell Dream. The message can be sent in such a way where if a failed save can cause a nightmare, and when you wake up, you take 3d6 psychic damage because the event was so horrific. The spell Feeble Mind. Here we go. 4d6 psychic damage. And you have to save, or else you get the attribute loss, like you become stupid. Let's see what else. Here's an interesting one. Aegeus. One of the only enchantment spells until, wait, we're getting to the Bard spell. And it causes 5d10 psychic damage every time that you act against the Gaius if you do something else. It could only happen once per day, but if you act in a way that's contrary to what you're supposed to be doing, it's just a big affront to your psyche. It fries your mind a little bit. The Phantasmal Force, which this spell is a lot different than it used to be in a lot of other editions. It only affects one person, which I thought was kind of interesting. There's another spell in there. It's like Silent Illusion, which is a lot more like the original Phantasmal Force. If you believe this, and you're taking damage via weapon attacks, or you're in hot lava, or whatever it is, whatever you think you are, you take 1d6 psychic damage per round. The spell Phantasmal Killer, much worse. You have to make a save, or you take 4d10 psychic damage every turn from this thing. Your turn. It's a round. Let's see. What else? Okay. So we got to that point. Then we get to two real oddballs out of all this. Although I still think that the bards, the instruments of the bards, it's kind of an oddball, because there's a lot of other things in there that with the magic items that are horrific. Reading out of the Book of Vile Darkness, and attuning yourself to some horrific artifact, or picking up the Sword of Cass and it wants to be fed blood and you haven't fed it blood yet, right? Picking up a lute and you're not attuned to it. It's not jiving with the rest of the mojo that I'm getting from this what psychic damage actually is, right? But I think they threw that in there as throwing a bone to the bard, and we'll get to that in a second. So you got two other things that seem to not exactly fit. First of all, you've got the Paladin. The Paladin has two spells. One is called Staggering Smite, and one is called Wrathful Smite. They're kind of like Smite and Smite Light. Wrathful Smite, you do 1d6 psychic damage in addition to the damage that your weapon does. And on Wrathful Smite, you do something like 46 psychic damage. I think they're like first and fourth level Paladin spells. It seems like those should have been radiant damage rather than psychic damage. Based on the other things that do radiant damage and based on what a paladin actually is, doesn't seem like that really fits as psychic damage. My opinion, but it doesn't seem to fit the flavor, the aesthetic of what psychic damage is supposed to be, even though they don't tell you what the heck it is. And the thing that got me started in the first place, these two bard spells, all right? There's one called Vicious Mockery. Does 1d4 psychic damage on a failed save. And that's a cantrip. And you have another bard spell, it's first level, that's called Dissonant Whispers. And so you whisper a discordant melody, and the target has to make a save or takes 3d6 psychic damage and flee. They'll take half damage. If they save, they don't have to flee. So you've got all these various things, these horrific, mind-bending things happening to you, cast through hell and what have you, and this causes you this affront to your psyche. But when a bard says, na 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 boo boo, you can't hit me, or pretty much, starts humming freeform jazz, and I understand it's supposed to be magical. This is supposed to be some kind of affront to your psyche, and cause you this, oh my God, I can't believe that, or maybe scatting or something, and that causes this big affront to your psyche. So, there's a part, where I look at this and say, what, the bard doesn't fit. Like it seems like, if anything, they kind of looked at all the cantrips, and at the end of it, they're putting this thing that's going to press, and they said, Tom, we forgot, country music, we forgot the bard. We got to give the bard something, some kind of damaging cantrip. And I'm like, I guess give him something where he, says something and tick somebody off and make him take, I don't know what, psychic damage, I guess. It seems very much just kind of thrown together. And there's some other parts of this book. There are parts of this book. There's a lot of good things to be said about this game. It seems very, very thrown together. I did not want this video to be so long, but here it is. And, same thing with the Dissonant Whispers. It just doesn't seem to fit. And I had discussions with my friends. We were talking about the fact that it's kind of a charm thing. I'll talk about what the bard is later on, because that's a whole different kettle of fish. Because the changes to it are aesthetically very bizarre. But if you can look at something like Dissonant Whispers and say, well, it's like a charm spell, and that's why it's causing all the psychic damage, there's a whole bunch of other charm spells in there that don't cause psychic damage. Why not? Because they're not bard spells? So at the end of the day, there is a big disparity between, in some areas, between the rules and the concept of what these are. In the case of what the bard does, and to a lesser extent, in the case of those two cleric spells, which I really think ought to be radiant damage. That's just from a read, and this is just my bias and preference thing. More importantly, though, is they don't tell you what the heck it is in the first place. It just simply says, let's see, psychic damage. Mental abilities such as a mind flayer's psionic blast deal psychic damage. And when they say, earlier, it says that the damage types have no rules of their own, but other rules such as damage resistant rely on the types. Now, I understand you can make this argument that, yes, well, all the stuff you just talked about was magic or damage resistance. Really, really bizarre that you got like our barbarian, who's resistant to everything except psychic damage when he's raging, the bear barbarian. When you have feigned death cast upon you, you're resistant to everything except psychic damage. It doesn't really seem, it feels like, to me, there are some special rules for this type of damage. I wonder that if in Tasha's, Cauldron of Everything, I think they got some psionics, maybe they'll expand more on psychic damage. But, at the end of the day, this is something that I like psychic damage. I like the concept of it. I feel like they could have done more with it. I feel like there's a lot of areas based on what does cause psychic damage, where there's other areas, other magic items, other spells where it's missing, where they could have used it to good effect. It just seems like something they kind of sprinkled around because there were some things that had psionics attached to them, and they threw some stuff in there just to kind of cover it up. And there's other areas of the books I'll talk about later, but where there seems to have been a lack of attention to detail. And there's some times where there's some really lazy creativity in the game, or lack of creativity, where they just did some poor writing. They spent a lot of time on certain areas, and other areas like this, it seems like they kind of just mailed in. Anyhow, that's my impression of it. I still dig it as a type of damage. It just needs to be explained better, because this is a rule book. This is a technical manual. I don't, because I looked on the internet too. One of the things I said I wasn't going to do, but just kind of dug around, looked around for a second, and says, well, geez, what do people say about psychic damage? Just see what pops up. And I found site after site after site where some guy was going to explain to you what psychic damage was. I don't need a guy on the internet to explain to me what psychic damage is. The thing costs $49.95. This book and the other book should explain to me what psychic damage is. It's your responsibility if you're charging me money. Have a good day, kids.